Okay, so in the last presentation, we decided to test this first hypothesis that we came up with, that you could only insert fucking between syllables. And we found that while it's accurate, it just doesn't get to the whole story, that we need to add on to that, because it's not just between syllables that you can get it, and you can't get it between just any two syllables. What we found was that there's something along these lines. Hypothesis 2, we'll call it. Only insert fucking between stressed syllables, right? And so that would explain things like you fucking taw, hot fucking dog, new fucking York. You know, why you can get fucking between those is because both of those syllables are stressed. All right, now that seems pretty good, right? It seems to get to what we wanted to get to. The problem is that going back to our states, we see exceptions to that as well. And I want you to look at these examples. Alabama, California, Colorado, and Massachusetts. Now, there are others as well beyond these that sound really good with fucking, right? So there are some that sound really good. There are some that sound, okay. And then there are some that sound bad. And then there are some that just sound terrible. I would say that Alabama sounds great, right? And that's kind of the go-to one, right? That's the one that people often think about. Ala-fucking-Bama, right? That sounds really good. Same thing for California. That sounds equally good. Califucking-Fornia, Cala-fucking-Rado, Massachusetts, and you can go on. There's several other states that sound really good with it. But notice, here's the stress pattern. Our primary stress is always on this second to last syllable, the penultimate syllable. Penultimate just means second to last. So the penultimate syllable is always going to have the heaviest stress. The final syllable, the ultimate syllable, has no stress at all. Right? So we've got Bama, Fornia, Rado, Massachusetts. Then we also get stress on that first syllable. It's not quite as heavy, so we call that a secondary stress. And then the second syllable is, again, unstressed. So what we're seeing here is this pattern of stress, unstress, stress, unstress, right? Dada, 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 right? In other words, what we have, going back to the word that we talked about in the previous presentation, we've got two trochees there, right? So in the first one, we've got the trochee Ala and then Bama. The second one, Cala and then Fornia. The third one, Cala, then Rado. And then the fourth one, Massa and then Massachusetts, right? So we have these nice pairs of trochees, and in those, it sounds great to put fucking in between there. But of course, when you do that, you've got an unstressed followed by a stressed one. So that's not going to answer our hypothesis 2, which is only insert fucking between stressed syllables. Well, that can explain why we can get Utah, but that doesn't explain why we can get Ala-fucking-Bama, Califucking-Fornia, Cala-fucking-Rado, Massachusetts, Mississippi, and so on. There's a whole bunch of them that sound really, really good that we just can't explain with hypothesis 2. And that's where our trochees are going to come in. That's where we need to understand a little bit deeper about how words are created, right? In school, you probably all talked about syllables and know that words are created of syllables. But what we're finding is that we need to go beyond the syllable to what's called a foot. This is a term that linguists borrowed from poetry, right? So in poetry, they talk about feet and the way that meter is divided up into feet. And that's exactly what we're saying when we talk about Shakespeare using iambic pentameter, right? So the penta just means 5, and so what we're saying is basically 5 iambs per line in his poetry and in some of his plays. And each one of those iambs counts as a foot. Well, of course, then there are these two kind of feet, iambs and trochees, that poets talk about, or poetry professors talk about, right? So each of these can act as a type of foot. Well, what we find, though, and as I was arguing in the previous presentation, is that English seems to focus on trochees. And in fact, some would argue that iambs really don't exist in English, that when Shakespeare was making iambic pentameter, that was somewhat artificial, that he was creating iambs sort of artificially, that really what we're dealing with is trochees in English. The words are built out of trochees, not out of iambs. Well, that's kind of interesting. So in the next presentation, we're going to go a little bit deeper into this idea that syllables build up to form feet, and it's feet that build up to form words. And so we've got these 3 layers, right? A word, a foot, and then syllables. All right? Now that's going to be relevant for us in coming up with our final hypothesis, which is going to be the hypothesis that we're going to stick with, hypothesis 3, we'll call it. All right, so that's going to do it for this presentation. In the next presentation, we'll introduce hypothesis 3.